Other announcement concerns that table over there, which has some very attractive books on it. I just want to draw your attention to it. Recently, an excellent manual, diplomatic manual to guide the operations of heads of mission was written by Ambassador Dennis Francis, and Miss Gail Guy and Mrs. Lenore Dorset, all very experienced Trinidadian diplomats. This is actually the first text of its kind to be written by Caribbean diplomats for the use, particularly, of Caribbean diplomats. It's an excellent text, and I just wanted you to know that it is available, and you might want to take a look at it, and hopefully purchase a copy before you leave. I must tell you that I've gone through it, and it's an excellent book. I bought a copy for myself, and I also bought a copy which I gave as a gift to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of St. Kitts. And we have about 2 to 3 copies in the Institute's library and the library of the Diplomatic Academy. Good, so that concludes business announcements. John, is Professor Knight online? So, good afternoon, everybody. And good afternoon, especially to the members of the panel, both those who are here in person and those who are joining us virtually. Good afternoon, Professor Knight.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Nice to see you.
Very good.
And thank you
for joining. Can you hear me okay?
Us. Sorry?
Can you hear me okay?
You can hear you just fine.
I heard me okay. Okay, fine. That's good. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll proceed to introductions. As you can see, the panel is entitled The Changing Global Space for Caribbean Diplomacy. We have 3 panelists. The keynote address will be given by Professor Andy Knight. And Professor Andy Knight is former director of the Institute of International Relations, and he is past chair of the Department of Political Science of the University of Alberta. He's currently Professor of International Relations in that department, and he is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has written and edited several books on global politics, the United Nations, terrorism, building sustainable peace, and regional integration movements. His most recent books include one entitled Female Suicide Bombings, A Critical Gendered Approach, written and authored together with Tanya Narojna of the University of Winnipeg and published in 2016, and Remapping the Americas, Trends in Region Making, co-edited with Julian Castro-Rea and Hamid Ghani in 2014. Now, our 2 other panelists this afternoon. The second speaker will be Ambassador Dennis Francis, retired ambassador for Trinidad and Tobago to the United Nations and other places. Ambassador Francis completed a 38-year career in the Foreign Service of Trinidad and Tobago approximately 3 years ago. At retirement in 2016, he had held the office of ambassador for 18 years, making him, to this point, the longest-serving ambassador of the Republic. His appointments as ambassador and permanent representative included serving in this capacity to the United Nations Office in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, the World Trade Organization, and some 22 other specialized agencies of the UN in Europe, including the FAO, WIPO, UNESCO, and UNCTAD. He was also accredited bilaterally as Ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago in Italy and Austria. When he was ambassador in Geneva, he held several sensitive and demanding chairmanships, including being chair of the negotiating group on trade rules of the WTO, chairman of the Council on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, also in the WTO, and the chair of the Commonwealth Group of Developing Countries in the UN. Before being posted to Geneva, Mr. Francis served as High Commissioner of Trinidad and Tobago to Jamaica and permanent representative to the International Seabed Authority. From Kingston, he was also accredited on a non-resident basis as ambassador to the Dominican Republic and to Haiti and Cuba. Mr. Francis was also appointed by His Excellency, the Governor General of Jamaica, to the office of Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, which he held for approximately 2 years. And our third presenter is former Ambassador Albert Ramdian, former Assistant Secretary General to the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Albert Ramdian has over 20 years of experience in international negotiations, multilateral diplomacy, public policy development and execution, strategic trade and business facilitation, and competitiveness. He has worked on institutional reform and restructuring at government and non-governmental levels, and in the private sector to achieve tangible solutions and results. He has an extensive network of contacts with highest levels of government, private sector, civil society, and institutions in the Americas. He is now in the international private sector himself. He has delivered more than 300 presentations to international gatherings of heads of state, global and regional organizations, member states, universities, business organizations, and international NGOs on a variety of topics ranging from the promotion of democracy and peace to multilateralism, conflict resolution, sustainable development, renewable energy, cybersecurity, youth, education, and private sector development. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we have a very high-powered and interesting panel before us. Welcome to the members of the panel. And without any further ado, I hand over to Professor Knight, who is our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, and thank you very much to all the folks there at the Institute of International Relations. It's like a little bit of a homecoming, except virtually. It's nice to be back there. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm operating.
Andy, sorry, do I have leave to interrupt you for 1 second? I forgot
Sure.
to say one important thing, which is each speaker has approximately 25 to 30 minutes.
That sounds good. Okay, that's about right. Okay, so I am now at the University of Alberta and have a pretty heavy teaching schedule this semester, so I was unable to make it to Trinidad, but I wish I could have been there to be there in person and deliver this presentation. I wasn't there yesterday, so I don't know exactly what was said yesterday, but I would like to place what I have to say today within the context of what Sir Alister McIntyre might have hoped to say about the changing direction of capitalist accumulation in the Caribbean and what that means for the region. As you know, we are living in a very new world in some sense. A new world, I would say, new world disorder in many respects. There is a sense that globalization, the intensification of globalization, the acceleration of the pace of globalization has left lots of people behind, and certainly created unequal relations across the globe. And the Caribbean, being a very small area of the world, but probably one of the most globalized regions of the world, is very much affected by what's happening in the broader trends of globalization. And I think I was reading something that was written about Sir Alister last night, and it was talking about the fact that he felt that the Caribbean needs to develop a greater capacity for dealing with the rest of the world in pursuit of its own indigenous development. And I think that means, to a large extent, having to rethink the whole concept of development. It also requires addressing what he called the implementation deficit in the region. There are lots of great ideas that come out of the region. I remember I think I saw uh, Mr. Dukaran somewhere in the audience there. I remember there was a conference held in Trinidad on looking at the future of the Caribbean, and a lot of really excellent ideas came out of that meeting. And then nothing happens. So there's like a sort of a absence of or deficit of implementation in the region that has to be addressed. And I think Sir Alister would want to see that happen. Um, One of the challenges, of course, for the region is that we have to overcome the limitations of smallness and the smallness of size. At the same time, take advantage of the opportunities to link up with other markets outside the region, not just within CARICOM, not just within the Caribbean region, but throughout the globe. And there are needs for diplomatic activity bilaterally, plurilaterally, and multilaterally. So drawing on Sir Alister McIntyre's vision, I would like to touch on two broad areas that I think sets the tone for our thinking about the Caribbean's future, and particularly the need for sustainable development in the region. One is the nature of the mutation and the growth of global capitalism that's happening right now in the region. Um, this is having a tremendous impact on the Caribbean. Many islands in the region, of course, are suffering from the inequities of globalization, as I mentioned before. But this trend of a growing global capitalism is creating distinct classes based on transnational capital that's causing some people to be left behind. And the second area that I would like to cover very briefly in this 20-minute presentation is what I think appears to be the shift in the global hegemony being played out in this hemisphere, a shift in hegemony that's being played out in this hemisphere as the US's position of global domination is being challenged by an emerging China. And there are obviously elements of that competition for global hegemony being played out in the Caribbean, perhaps, as I said before, the most globalized region of the world. So, first of all, I think it's important to sort of put this talk into context. Jeb Sprague, who has written a very excellent book looking at sort of a historical materialist approach to economic development in the Caribbean. He recently explored in very great detail the structural processes that have led Caribbean economies to transition into this new global stage of world capitalism. He focuses on four major areas: tourism, export processing, mining, migration, and the reverse flows of remittances. And he says that at the center of this transformation, at the center of this transition, really is the change in the relations of production. So what we are witnessing in many respects is a rise of a new class relations, which is linked directly to transnational production, and unfolding, I think, five major traits that are being found in the region. The first is that the Caribbean economies are now integrated into a rising transnational financial system. And the second is that and there is an envelopment of the region by transnational networks of production. And the third is that there is exploitation and marginalization of the popular classes in relation to global capitalism. The workers are being left behind in many respects. And then fourth is the emergence of a transnationally oriented state elite that have much more in common with the elites in the global north than they do with the people of the global south. And finally, what he calls the new subcontractor networks that are being developed through which local businesses are deepening their relationship and their orientation to transnational capital. So this is causing, in some ways, havoc with any attempts at developing indigenous and sustainable economies in the region. Top elites in the United States and top elites within global north, in some ways, are working to undermine any form of local and autonomous sustainable development. It's very, very difficult to do this with that kind of resistance. You just have to look at the undermining, for example, of ALBA by the United States and the attempts at trying to stop any form of indigenous development in certain countries. Instead, I think these elites promote capitalist economic integration that is transnational in nature and that is unmoored from local needs and local control. And this historical process has not been smooth by any means. It has led to significant crises in the region. The first crisis is the social polarization that we see happening in Trinidad and Tobago, in many of the countries of the region, as transnational capitalists obtain unimaginable levels of wealth, while the working poor and lower class and lower income people face exploitation, marginalization, and exclusion. There is also a crisis of political legitimacy in the Caribbean as state policymakers try to maintain the loyalty of their local constituents, even as they are intensifying policies that benefit the transnational capitalist class. And thirdly, I think all this is occurring alongside catastrophic climatic change, as we noticed just recently with Dorian, the hurricane, that's propelled largely by industrialization and carbon-intensive consumption. And I think the proliferation of and the intensification of hurricanes is a good example of what is happening. That's making it very difficult for countries in the Caribbean to develop economically. As some people might argue, the hurricane in Dominica, for example, pushed that country back about 20 years in terms of development. God knows how many years it'll take for the Bahamas to overcome what's happened recently with the Hurricane Dorian. And fourth, there's over-accumulation. The over-accumulation and the capitalist crisis associated with the endemic instability of capitalism is very much a challenge for Caribbean leaders and Caribbean people and Caribbean economies. The global capitalist system is, in fact, I would argue, conflict-ridden and tenuous to a large extent. National circuits of accumulation are being subsumed under transnational ones. And there is a fierce resistance from below, fierce resistance from anti-globalization forces, even within the region. So this is not an easy set of circumstances for the region. Workers are being laid off in large number because of the rise of some people call it Uberism, But the rise of artificial intelligence, automation, and computerized oligopolies that are happening in the service sector. And there's this mantra of efficiency and productivity and doing more with less that's really challenging the labor movement, movement within the region. And now, in some cases, those particular values like efficiency and productivity and competition and so on are not bad things in and of themselves. But when they are used solely to expand the profits of small ruling elites, when they're used solely to lead to the growth of the transnational capitalist class at the expense of others, this can only lead to resentment and major problems, including growing inequalities and environmental degradation. And so you know that something is wrong with that scenario. So workers have less and less control over the conditions of their social reproduction now. Heavy investments in robotics and artificial intelligence and smart tools are more and more leading to jobs being eliminated in traditional sectors. There's less interest in national economic development now than it's ever been before. So the priority now is more transnational capital rather than in that indigenous development. So this is something that I think we need to spend some time thinking about as we rethink what should be the nature of economic development to be sustainable in the region. And it's for that reason I've been pushing this notion of thinking about a move away from a linear form of economic development to embrace what we call a circular economic development. I wouldn't go into much more detail because I want to give you some time to think about what I've said and move on to some of the other speakers. We can have an interesting discussion about this, but there's definitely a change in discourse, a change in discourse that's happening in China, in the European Union, and perhaps should be happening as well in the Caribbean about the changing nature of economic development in the region. So I'd leave it there, and then we'll have a chance to have further discussions in the question and answer period.
Thank you very much, Andy. And now I invite Ambassador Francis to take up where he left off.
Thank you, Professor Byron. And may I take the opportunity to congratulate the Institute on convening this very important seminar to examine how the Caribbean can address the burning issues that confront it developmentally as a region. We're in a session that is dealing with the foreign policy dimension and probably imperatives to support Caribbean development in the future. Now, this is a region with a very strong tradition of foreign policy independence. I think we're all familiar with the fact that the whole thrust of Caribbean regionalism was and is that having earned its political independence from our colonial masters, and they have therefore earned the right to exist and to have a point of view that was distinctly its own and not subjugated to the needs and the priorities of any interests outside of the Caribbean, that the Caribbean should maintain a posture of independence in its relations with third parties. The first Prime Minister of this country was an avid defender of the view that Caribbean problems require Caribbean solutions by Caribbean people. And that whereas we are members of an international community, there is a Caribbean vision and worldview that must inform our foreign policy positions and assist and support the region's objectives in economic integration and development. So independence in foreign policy is not and has not been new. It's been there for a long time. It's been cemented in the Treaty of Chaguaramas from 1973, when CARICOM was first born, and it continues there today. We could look briefly at how that independence had been exerted. One of the outstanding achievements of this region that sometimes you get the forgotten is that when the Cold War was hot in the 1970s, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, and Guyana jointly decided that they would establish diplomatic relations with Cuba. That was a bold and daring thing to do in 1972. And it was bold and daring because the established regional hegemon was putting extraordinary pressure on the countries of the Western Hemisphere to break relations with Cuba. And with the exception of Mexico and Canada, I believe it was, all countries broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. But four of the smallest, perhaps most vulnerable economically, countries in the region that had an independent view took the decision to go in the other direction. I have a recollection as a high school student, sitting in the convention center at Chaguaramas in 1973 at the launching of CARICOM, assigned as the liaison aide to the Cuban observer delegation for the signing of the treaty, a delegation that was headed by the current sitting president of Cuba, Raul Castro. Imagine the optics of that at a time when the Cold War was hot. So foreign policy independence has been a central feature of foreign policy development in this region. And I'm happy to say Elements of that persist even today. But the world that exists today is markedly different from what existed then. Back then, we were in a bipolar system. It was international capitalism competing for dominance with international communism. Everything was politicized. The World Cup football, the Olympic Games, it was all politicized. And these young nations had to find their way in a sometimes unfriendly, unforgiving world to promote their economic and social development against the challenges of resource constraints, small markets, lack of economies of scale, high unemployment, and the other challenges that persisted, the structural challenges that still today confront and confound us developmentally. Now what do we have? We have an international system that is markedly different. It's markedly different, with all kinds of uncertainties and tensions. You have a situation in which the acknowledged leader of the international community, the United States, has adopted an America First policy that on the face of it suggests disengagement from active global leadership. The whole notion of American exceptionalism that has existed for a long time, based on the premise that American values and principles, democratic principles, human rights, the rule of law, that has virtually disappeared. You have a system characterized by tension, uncertainty. Andy referred to it as disorder. I'll refer to it as disruption. We are witnessing the politics of disruption globally. Nothing is predictable. Old alliances have become frayed as the United States and its Western allies seemingly seek to establish a new kind of understanding with respect to the actual meaning and implementation of the defense alliance. And the fact that the United States has refused to commit openly and publicly to the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO treaty has caused considerable unease and anxiety among the Western European states. So much so that the Chancellor of Germany warned her compatriots, I think it was in the wake of the G7 meeting, that Europe can no longer, and I'm trying to quote, I might miss a word here or there, Europe can no longer depend on others for its security. So what you have is that the foundations of the Western Alliance have been shaken and are being shaken to its core, because there are no longer any guarantees. Part of the impetus for this has been the concern by the United States that the Europeans have not been forthcoming enough in meeting their commitments, their financial commitments to NATO. And truth be told, President Trump has, in fact, been relatively successful in getting the Europeans to pay more to finance their own defense. But outside of that, lingering questions about the stability and the meaning of NATO in the current situation remains. It's not just in defense, it's in trade and business, where the United States has raised tariffs on European steel and aluminum imports, causing them to become uncompetitive in US markets. Now, the notion is that those tariffs hurt the European exporters. And they do, because they drive up the cost of those products in the United States. But the people who actually pay for those tariffs are US consumers, because those costs are passed on to the consumers by the importers. It hurts Europe because there's an adverse impact on demand. So no doubt the Europeans will be hurt. But US consumers of those products are also being hurt. More than that, there's a threat to impose a digital tax on French exports of digital goods. So there is now an uneasy relationship within that Western alliance that, in fact, 50 years ago was responsible, the United States and Western Europe, for the establishment of this ordered, predictable, stable global world order. And if you look further afield, you'll see that the pattern continues. We are now witnessing a reduction of tensions on the Korean Peninsula. But you recall that there was a time when there was considerable anxiety in Washington and in many capitals of the world that we seemed to be heading for confrontation of some type. And more than that, that the rhetoric that was being used on both sides could unintentionally trigger a confrontation, almost by error. I saw on CNN today that there is now talk of the President of the United States meeting with the President of Iran. This is the latest development. Based on a recommendation, I believe it was reported by the French, that in exchange for a $15 billion package for the Iranians, they might be prepared to cease the development of their nuclear programs. But this is coming within weeks of a heightening of tensions in that part of the world, in Iran, and after the interruption of international shipping routes by the Iranians as a consequence of the fact that the nuclear agreement that had been negotiated under the Obama administration has now been repudiated by the sitting administration in Washington on the grounds that America can get a better deal if negotiations are recommenced between the players. Iran, of course, has insisted that they will not reopen negotiations on the agreement because they have met all their commitments. And this has been independently verified by the UN nuclear watchdogs that they had met all of their commitments under the old agreement. Those are the atmospherics in which the Caribbean must find its way. Great uncertainty. And I forgot something that we cannot forget: the apparent looming prospect of a global recession occasioned by the ongoing trade war between the United States and China, which again, today, there is an announcement from Washington that the United States will postpone imposition of the additional tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States until, I believe, October 15th. So there is, again, a window of opportunity for negotiations and back-channel discussions, I suppose, between the Americans and the Chinese to see how to forestall the prospect of increased interruption of trade. Multilateralism is also under threat, not just in trade, but in other places. The Americans clearly, in the current administration, seem to be more strategically inclined to negotiate bilaterally than to negotiate in the multilateral setting. Time doesn't permit, but I would advise you, if you have an interest, to go on to the World Trade Organization website, and you will see that the WTO itself has come under increased pressure in a very important area of its work, which is the appointment of judges as part of the dispute settlement process. So, we in the Caribbean have to find our way in this milieu of total uncertainty, tension, potential instability, rampant globalization, and a new attitude that is markedly different from before, whereby the fact that you're small and you can't do anything about your size somehow attracts support and sympathy from those who can help to make a difference in your circumstances. What worked in the 60s and 70s and 80s, for example, in terms of negotiating benefits and advantages for the Caribbean, have to a significant degree lost their resonance today. They've lost their resonance, and to a significant degree because the Caribbean, as challenged as we are now a middle-income region. We do have high pockets of poverty and vulnerability, but the metrics confirm that we are now a middle-income region, and that there are parts of the world that are in more urgent need of support than we are. And it's not said quite in that way, but if you listen carefully, the imputation is, yes, we understand your challenge, but perhaps you need to do a better job of how you deploy the resources that you have at your disposal. So we cannot rely entirely on others to come forward with largesse to help us to fix our problems. We have got to take ownership of those problems, and we have got to be seen to be acting in our own self-interest in order to lift our economies and societies for the future. How can we do that? How can we do that? People have always commented that for a group of small countries, the Caribbean has punched over its weight in the international system. And we have. And we have. Partly because the debates, the important debates in the global system has not just been about power, but also about principle. And Caribbean principles and vision of itself and of its place in the world has delivered for us in the past in a way that one might have thought not possible. So we have been able to punch above our weight in the past. And I'm quite sure that with commitment and careful analysis, we can continue to do so in the future. But what is to be the basis of it? What is the platform? I want to contend that it's staring us in the face. And there's been a lot of reference to it over the course of the last 2 days. But sometimes, as you know, the thing that is right before you, for refractory reasons, you don't see quite in the way that can help to make a quantum difference in how you approach important challenges. And my contention is that the issue to take us where we need to go in order to ensure that 50 years from now, this region does not find itself at the bottom of the development ladder, as our colleague from the CDB mentioned yesterday. It's a shocking and frightening prospect. We are in a crisis. Whether we accept it or not, we are in a crisis. And when you are in a crisis, you've got to take action. I want to propose that the issue that can take us there is climate change and sustainable development. And there's a reason that it can take us there. It can take us there because it's got global impact. Everybody, virtually all countries of the world, virtually, until a year or so ago, including the United States, signed the Paris Climate Agreement. The science is undeniable. The importance and the relevance is undeniable. The images of the consequences are real. We see them every evening on our television screens. Consider what it would cost to rehabilitate and reconstruct the Bahamas to pre-Dorian levels. And we know in the Caribbean, and the statistics have confirmed, that the potential exists for this to happen repeatedly, year in, year out. This year it was the Bahamas. 2 years ago it was Dominica, British Virgin Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. Who's next? The issue is climate change. And not climate change as an add-on to proposals for economic development. Climate change as the anchor, as the issue. It can't simply be about constructing resilient, purpose-built infrastructure, such as shelters and schools, hospitals, police stations, water treatment plants, government campuses, as important as they are. Adaptation is important. Otherwise, you keep spending recurrently on the same structures, the same facilities. Mitigation is at least as important. We need in this region to shift to a green economy. That has to be the development strategy and the basis on which everything else hangs, because it is an existential issue for us. We saw with Arnold McIntyre's presentation yesterday that the Caribbean has been hit most frequently and with the most intense hurricanes and disasters of all the small island developing states in the world. So our vulnerability is the highest. That has been documented. We need to align ourselves with those countries and regions that can support us in this quest for environmental sustainability, Because without it, well, let's not ponder what the consequences are. Some years ago, I read a report produced by ECLAC. I just want to share this with you. It reported on a study commissioned, I believe it was, by an energy company in Trinidad and Tobago that showed that by 2050, one possible scenario is that the entire peninsula of Point Lisas and the surrounding areas could be inundated by sea level rise. Consider what that would mean for the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. And it would not only be Trinidad and Tobago, because sea level would not only rise in Trinidad and Tobago. Consider what it would mean for the Caribbean, whose economy, I'm a geographer by training, so we always take a spatial analysis of these things, whose economy, the Caribbean economy, is largely a coastal economy. What does it mean for the Caribbean if in fact that inundation were to take place? Because it is in those coastal areas that you have the interface between the domestic economy and the international economy. So I propose that we make an all-encompassing effort to develop, to position climate change and environmental sustainability as a central pillar or plank of our foreign relations. It's not just about getting access to the money in the Green Climate Fund. It's about engaging bilaterally and multilaterally with potential partners who confront challenges not unlike our own, and some who don't, in order to build the basis for green development in this region and the new industries that can be spawned by doing so. Now, I'm not unaware that there are some places in the Caribbean where, including perhaps Trinidad and Tobago, where a proposal such as that would cause anxiety. But no one is proposing the abandonment of hydrocarbon exploitation. There's no reason why green development cannot exist side by side with traditional energy use. The question is finding the right energy mix so that you have a more balanced development and building an economy that in time is carbon neutral. And it is possible to do it. If you check, you'll discover that the United Arab Emirates, one of the most prolific energy producers in the world, has a dynamic green industry development portfolio. Very dynamic. They have infused green development in every sector of national development. I believe that we need to do the very same thing in this region, and that we must use our foreign relations to leverage that capacity with those in the world, in this hemisphere and beyond, who can play a role in helping us to cope with the risk of climate disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Francis. And I now invite our final panelist, former Ambassador Albert Ramdian, who is going to speak on the topic, A New Turn in Diplomacy for the Caribbean, in the Hemisphere and the World.
almost want to say good morning, but it's not good morning. I'll put this away, I don't have this. Okay, like the previous two speakers, I don't have slides. I didn't want to make it more intensive for everybody. It's a late hour. This is not going to be easy, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. You know, after 18 to 20 speakers, I'm the last speaker. So I have to find a way to keep your attention over the coming 20, 25 minutes. At the same time, as the last speaker, it has some benefits because basically all has been said. So I could also stop here and give you the time back. But I won't do that because I felt that over the past 2 days, all presentations, and my compliments to the organizers for selecting the people, but all presentations were excellent, useful, in many ways, with solid analysis, good recommendations, sometimes bold, some findings and projections disturbing, but it's all useful because that's the purpose of this conference. So congrats to the organizers. It has helped me in crafting my own presentation because that information is useful. It has helped me also not to repeat what has already been said. So I'll focus really on context setting and also on a little bit of the main piece, which is talking a little bit about a new diplomatic approach. Let me officially thank the university and Director Byron of the Institute of International Relations for the invitation, and Professor Dukaran for the initial discussions on participation. I believe that what we have heard yesterday and today tells it all, that it was a necessary, and it is a necessary and a timely exercise. I really hope that the political and institutional leadership of the Caribbean community will be informed in detail about all the proposals and the presentations. I know that a document is coming out of this, but given the importance, the sooner the better, because there are extremely valuable recommendations to be made to the leaders. And I also want to suggest, Professor Byron, maybe this is a kind of a take stock symposium, but with a wider objective of looking forward and analytically think about the future. And I think take stock symposia helps, and it should be done on a regular basis, every 2 or 3 years, so that the region is monitored in terms of its developments. So I would suggest that, and it will certainly add to the role and the relevance of the University of the West Indies and the Institute of International Relations to meaningfully contribute to public policy making and influence, most importantly, influence the future of the Caribbean region. Let me also say up front that I speak here in a personal capacity, so nothing that I say, my views, my remarks, are not necessarily those which are being shared by my current employer or any former government or organization I was associated with. And most of what I will say is based on personal experience in the engagement with Caribbean diplomats over the past 15 to 20 years. But before I do that, I do want to say something about the person who is being honored with this conference, Sir Alister McIntyre. We celebrate his life as a great scholar. It has been reiterated by many that he was a Caribbean scholar, a diplomat, and economist in service of the region. But coming from a country, and this is also part of our reality as CARICOM, as the Caribbean community, coming from a country on the mainland of South America with a Dutch colonial heritage, and historically limited until 15 years ago in its intellectual and political connection with the Commonwealth's Caribbean integration process, Sir Alister McIntyre's breadth of work and influence is not well known in Suriname. That's a reality that indicates also, although we are close, the connectedness is not there in terms of that kind of valuable academic exercise. But I did have the pleasure to meet and briefly work with him in his late years of service on a few occasions. And whenever we spoke, it was always a great intellectual experience. And that is something which I have kept, and it was always a moment of learning. It has helped me as a Surinamese, pretty young coming into the Caribbean region as a member state, to understand the Caribbean better. And that's something which we should not underestimate in terms of the understanding which is there from Suriname or Haiti for the workings or the culture within this region. It is still a lot of work to be done to create that connectivity with and between the people. We should not underestimate how much misunderstanding there is in that regard. But it helped me, and what I appreciated most from Sir Alister, apart from that fact that he was a true Caribbean person, is that I always had a sense that he embraced the newcomers in CARICOM with the same commitment as the founding member states. That is not a sentiment which was always there. Not everybody had that kind of connection or response. But Sir Alister always had. And I'll give you an example where that was reflected in a very concrete way. We, as CARICOM's Assistant Secretary General then, I took part in the preparations for trade agreement negotiations with the Dominican Republic. And Sir Alister McIntyre was a technical lead for that negotiation. So we had our meeting in CARICOM as a prep. And something came up related to forestry and lumber and exports and so on in that trade arrangement with the Dominican Republic. Guyana, the Republic of Guyana, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, was present and made a very strong presentation on what it expected to gain from it in terms of certain exemptions and also preferences, which was what you should do, what should happen. When done, Sir Alister looked around and he looked at me and he said, your country, referring to Suriname, has a lot of forest as well. But no one is representing Suriname at this table today. So why don't we decide that what Guyana is asking for will also count for Suriname? And that is, in itself, countries need to represent their own interests in such a negotiation. But as lead technical person, he took the decision that even though a country was not present, but under similar circumstances, that he would include that country's interest in those negotiations. That is what we expect from a Caribbean man in terms of understanding the importance of having all member states equally treated, whether they are there or whether they are absent. And so my respect for him grew that day almost exponentially, and I'm happy to say today that as a Surinamese, I can salute him for his sterling contribution to the region. I wanted to share that with you because I think it signifies a person, but also in terms of his relationship with the region he worked for. Now, before I go to the subject matter, and this question came to me after having listened to all the other 18 presentations. One question remains for all of us to answer, and maybe it's a conference in itself, but I don't think anybody has really addressed it, but it is there. And that question is, fundamentally, is why, if we know what needs to be done in the region, why it is not happening? Why, with all the knowledge, all the expertise, all the ideas, all the analysis, all the recommendations, why it is still not happening? And I don't want to go into detail. Later on, at the end, I'll come back to this. But I know that that is a question because that goes to the heart of the matter of you can have the best ideas if the decision is not taken to implement or to adopt or to enforce, nothing will happen. So there's a discussion there which is maybe much more a political, social, cultural issue, but it needs to be addressed because that is really management. Now, to the subject matter, I'm going to present some views on Caribbean diplomacy in this evolving international and regional political space. Ambassador Francis has already indicated how complex that is, but how impactful that can be. Yesterday we heard a lot about the challenges the region faces, the characteristics of the region. I won't go into that. Some may even challenge the question itself, because some will question whether we can speak at all about a diplomacy that is truly regional at this point in time. And I'll come back to that because there is some truth in that, whether we do have regional Caribbean diplomacy. I always feel that if we want to understand how a region, or a country for that matter, operates and how we want to implement foreign policy and diplomacy, we need to understand pretty well our political, social, cultural, and economic fabric as individual countries and as a regional community, but equally the other side, the international context. So not only what we want to understand from within, but also beyond. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make policy, and certainly difficult to engage with the international community in a meaningful way. So basically, we have to look at 4 questions. And some of these questions were answered throughout the conference. One is, who are we? Who are we as a people of the Caribbean? What are our aspirations? What do we want? The second question is, where are we in our development? And this issue has been answered more or less yesterday. And today, and yesterday as well, the third question which we need to ask ourselves is, where do we want to be in 25 years, or for that matter in 2050, with that disturbing perspective? We need to ask these questions because it is not about the coming 4 or 5 years of an election period. It's about the strategic outlook towards an end which we can describe. And the last question is then, the more practical one, how do we get there? So we have to ask these questions all the time. Who are we as a people? What kind of social values underpin our being? What kind of relationship we want to develop with the world? Where are we currently? Where do we want to be? And how do we get there? Those are 4 fundamental questions which I ask myself in any kind of policy environment, whether it's in the private sector or in public policy. The first question, and I'm not going to go into these questions, but the first question wasn't really answered throughout the conference, and maybe because it's a topic on its own. I think Professor Byron spoke about culture at the beginning, and it is something to do with culture. We are a region which is enormously diverse, not only in geography, in size, but also in people, in culture, in language, in cuisine, and we should recognize that. We have historical different backgrounds, we have legal different systems, education-wise different systems. So this is not a homogeneous society or a region as such. It is a heterogeneous society, and we have to really keep that in mind. Like size and natural disasters, that is a given, and we should add that to that list. We all, more or less, as a people of the Caribbean, but also as 14 member states. I mentioned 14 member states because when internationally, so in the international engagement, it's basically about 14 member states who are independent. And Montserrat is not represented in the diplomatic field directly. So in terms of the 14 member states, I think generally speaking, there is a solid commitment to democracy, to human rights, to rule of law, and NGOs and trade unionism. I think those are great assets. And I'll come back to that because that's a critical element for us internationally, because that is how we are recognized. No doubt political and economic integration is a process. We have heard that over the past 2 days. It's still evolving, but I believe that since 1973 and even 10 years before that, we must have reached a level of maturity in the integration process. At least that's what I would hope, that can provide a foundation to demonstrate unity and to make use of opportunities for collective action. Because that is exactly what will be required if we want to be successful in our diplomatic performance over the coming 10, 15, 20 years. The challenges our region faces are mostly of an economic and financial nature. We have heard that yesterday. We have an educated and multilingual workforce, a reasonably well-developed financial system, functioning logistics and manufacturing sectors with opportunities for growth, and those are positive elements. We should not always think on the dark side of it. But we have to recognize that while we have those things, politics, international affairs, and sustainable development are interrelated. And for a targeted foreign policy and fit-for-purpose diplomatic apparatus to deliver, leaders and relevant political leaders and policymakers, but also legislators, we often tend to forget the legislators, need to understand the risks and opportunities to this region. And I'm not always convinced that that's the case. I sometimes believe that there is a widening gap between aspirations and reality. And that cannot be the best circumstance to make policy. Times have changed. Everybody spoke about it over the past days. The world has changed. We see major trends in the social fabric of societies in large economies are changing, not always for the better. And I don't have it specifically about the politics of recent times. I'm speaking really about social values in societies. In our own societies, we have a large part of the population with a different way of thinking, and that's the youth. And the question is, how connected are we? And how connected are our policies to their needs and their aspirations? Because they will decide our performance in the future. So those are questions which we need to ask ourselves before we come to policy making. And therefore the question remains, how do we answer this challenge of an effective foreign policy? How do we prepare a response to those challenges that is effective, that is dignified, and serving our interests and needs? And let me say this, in terms of the developments in the region, if we would do a SWOT analysis, the strength and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats, basically we are 14 independent nations with a voice and vote in the international environment. Size and periodic threats of natural disasters are a given. We are 18 people, no significant strategic market for any kind of major product. We have lost our location as a strategic geopolitical tool since the end of the Cold War. We don't have nuclear sites. We have no military power. What we do have is a strong dependency on tourism. We are prone to terrorism because of our openness and security-related threats. We are prone to natural hazards, already mentioned. Our growth options are there, but are limited on the long term. And again, certain countries are reaching the limit, and I say this cautiously, limit of their economic growth because of size. We have to understand that. So you have to be either going deeper in the products which you can offer, like somebody spoke about tourism in terms of diversification, or you'll have to do with what you have. That's a simple truth, but it's a reality which we need to embrace. Otherwise, it's going to result in wrong decisions and wrong aspirations. Maybe that there is one thing that can become strategic, and it depends on the coming months and years. Oil and gas can be strategic in terms of control, investments, and as a political tool. And in this case, specifically speaking about Guyana and Suriname, but also with the expertise which Trinidad and Tobago brings to the table in terms of the same industry. But that is most likely going to be the only one which we can exercise effectively as a tool only if it's done in the right way. That is developments in our own region. Well, the ever-evolving, increasing changes in the world requires us again to have a realistic and pragmatic assessment of foreign policy objectives and our performance. And I'll speak about the performance and the objectives a little bit later. We will have to make, as a region, based on this assessment, critical and bold decisions. And some of them are going to be hard decisions. if we want to avoid a couple of things to happen. We have surprising changes in leadership in many countries worldwide, and they have not resulted, as Ambassador Francis was indicating just now, globally or regionally in more stability and peace. In our own region, look at Venezuela, what it has done. That's a case on its own. But also other things which are happening. This nationalistic style of priority setting and perspectives have led to selfish actions that have resulted in weakening international and regional multilateral organizations. In the Western Hemisphere, we have also already seen that with the difficulties, especially in Brazil, that UNASUR is de facto eliminated. It does exist, but it doesn't function. So that's a critical issue. We're speaking about 11 countries on one continent not having a multilateral approach in terms of policy making. UNASUR existed because of Brazil's leadership. So in the absence of a strong leadership in the South, we see that falling apart. We have weak performances of other regional integration systems. And most importantly, the hemispheric body, the Organization of American States, has isolated itself as an honest broker of political conflicts and peace building over the past 3 years. And these are potentially devastating developments if countries and leaders and organizations continue to focus on specific issues, on national issues, policies of isolation, and this is not good for small states, because that is exactly where small states do not survive in a very individual process of nation-state diplomacies. So add to this, and this is then the end of context setting, add to this technology, which we spoke about a lot, and globalization as disrupting factors in the international political, economic, financial system. It demonstrates then even more why it is so important that leaders and policymakers have a solid understanding based on facts and credible intelligence, professional analysis based on pragmatic assumptions, and start to identify and agree on CARICOM shared priorities and interests. And I'm speaking about CARICOM shared priorities and interests, not individually. And for that, we will need a whole apparatus of skilled diplomats, totally different from what we have now. And I'm not speaking ill about anybody, but we will need to have different types of diplomats who tactically can carry out a consistent, credible, and strategic regional foreign policy. Okay, let me come to, in the last 10 minutes, which we'll have to stretch. 2 comments before I go to the content of strategy and policy for diplomacy. I see, and this is maybe not what all countries accept, I see foreign policy and diplomatic performance as an investment, as a financial investment. Don't see it as a service or a representation. It is purely an investment. Yesterday we spoke about how can we facilitate growth. It is only if you invest, and this is investment in foreign policy. And this investment will result in not only facilitation of growth and stability, but also trying to mitigate external risks, optimizing opportunities. And if you speak about investments, then we need to make it measurable from a political perspective, measurable from the financial, economic perspective, because you need returns on that investment. And that's a different approach of looking at a surface of a government. And again, I consider foreign affairs a business with key performance indicators, which should be stipulated before. And in my view, possibly that's the only business a government should be really involved in, but that's a separate issue. The second one I like to make is that we have to realize that in the current context, and that came through as well is that national borders, and this morning Professor Dukaran spoke about this, national borders do not matter when it comes to rules of engagement, when it comes to international politics. They don't matter anymore. So this thing about keeping to your territorial integrity or to the economic space is not going to help us to provide meaningful diplomatic engagement. Again, that's my personal view, but we will have to work around it with smart diplomacy. And where we expect that the international system is equal in terms of all the member states, it's not. The practice has been that power distribution is not equal. It has a negative impact on effective participation of small states in the international order. So, what's my take on the Caribbean community in terms of moving forward then? The Caribbean community needs a geopolitical strategic plan as a region. And based on that, you need to design then your foreign policy and your international trade. But without that analysis of a geopolitical strategic plan, which need to take place at the highest political levels of the region, which should be coherent, it's not easy to understand the world, but also to have a response, to have a plan. We need a plan to be able to respond to all the developments we spoke about in the past 2 days. Another reason for that is, apart from good policy and good management of your region, is that we are such an open region in terms of our economies, our the tourism industry, that we need to engage with the international trading system, and we are equally vulnerable to what is happening internationally, and therefore you need a plan to be able to mitigate negative impacts and maintain relative political stability and economic stability. Keep in mind, when you're an open economy, you have inherent in that process external pressures from countries, you have manipulation, and you have a strong reliance on external actors. That comes with that territory. You don't control fully what comes to you, but you can respond to it effectively if you have smart diplomacy. So yesterday, Professor Dukaran gave a little bit of a description about what economic integration strategy will look like from a convergence perspective. I like to rephrase that a bit and apply that with some different elements to what is the diplomatic logic of convergence. And this is, I'll read it and can later discuss that. The diplomatic logic of convergence is not just about political and symbolic representation of the region on the world stage, and I speak about other countries of the region. The diplomatic logic of convergence is not just about political and symbolic representation of the region on the world stage. It is about sustainable value creation and beneficial political influence, and mobilizing forces and resources to strengthen resilience, competitiveness, and capture business opportunities. Here you see my clear view on two aspects. One, diplomacy, Caribbean diplomacy, is in service of the integration process. We have to accept that fact. It can't be only in the service of nation states, on national governments. And secondly, I'm making a clear plea that it is maybe high time, it may be wishful thinking or too ambitious, but it is high time for an honest and open debate on whether CARICOM's external interests should not be carried out under the flag of a common CARICOM regional foreign policy as a region. Whether we call it associative or group diplomacy, doesn't matter, but we need to have a CARICOM foreign policy that is regional in its nature on key issues, not on all issues, but on key issues that address the region's interests in a positive manner, and where we can leverage effectively our strength of 14 nations, 14 votes. And it will include the need to have CARICOM missions, like the EU has missions in the different capitals or important organizations. And in fact, CARICOM's Treaty of Chaguaramas, which was mentioned before, mandates coordination of member states' foreign policies. The only thing I'm doing here is I'm elevating this commitment to a higher level, not only coordination, but adoption of regional foreign policy briefs. And for that institutional framework, which was put in place in 1973, I personally believe it has been ineffective and needs to be reformed. And I'll come back later on and give you some ideas about what needs to be done in concrete terms. So, from a policy and strategy perspective, Caribbean diplomacy in its very nature and purpose is tied to the degree in which integration efforts are characterized by unity. Caribbean diplomacy must be an integral part and extension of the goals and purpose of the integration process in the region. If regional integration fails or is weak, and many have argued yesterday that integration is key to growth, foreign policy will fail, and diplomatic execution will be ineffective. I strongly believe, because I have seen it successfully applied, that Caribbean strength is in its unity, in its people, and in the values it represents. There is a lot of respect for small countries who can present themselves honestly and with values which can help a process moving forward. It is not always about the power play. Sometimes the big powers need small countries to come in between and say, you know, it's time to move differently. And I have seen examples of that. I can give it the San Jose meeting of the OAS General Assembly on the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was postponed 3 months later, 3 months later, simply because CARICOM felt the document wasn't ready enough. We have other examples in terms of Haiti, in terms of the Peru crisis. We can play a role as small states. And that is often misunderstood, that you can play a role. You don't need to be powerful. Sometimes, in my own experience, large countries would ask you to play a role simply because they can't find themselves. And I have examples of how that when Jamaica was the chair of the Security Council of the United Nations, where they played a role, where big powers like Russia and the United States could not find themselves, but because of the interventions of Jamaica at that point in time, resulted in solutions on adoption of resolutions and conventions. So we can play a role. It is about how do you put that diplomacy together. We need to take the moral high ground, and this is where I think, we need to have good leadership. And I think the example of Cuba earlier was the moral high ground, demonstrating leadership without being afraid of being fearful of the consequences that potentially could have. But it worked. Look, we have enormous, in the region we have enough assets. I call them assets because I see them really as part of an investment. But our social fabric, our diversity, our peaceful style of living, our ability to resolve conflicts, our capability to support democracy, rule of law, and human rights, trade unionism, the NGO community, the openness of society, all those things are critical elements to insert in this international diplomatic scene. And that is, for me, key in terms of how you build your Caribbean diplomacy and your foreign policy. We should be ambitious, pragmatic, but always principled on the ground rules of engagement. We need to be the broker of peaceful settlement. I have seen moments where Caribbean diplomats, Caribbean foreign ministers were asked to lead missions to resolve a conflict. Well, in the past 15 years, I have not seen that anymore. And that has to do with our own commitment if we want to play a role. But it makes an enormous difference in the respect and the perception about the region if a CARICOM foreign minister is asked to lead, whether it's in the Middle East or in this region, to lead a mission to resolve a crisis. I know that, I think the last time it was with Foreign Minister Katie Knight when he went to Colombia. These are issues which do not affect the region. It is outside of the region, but that's where you gain most of the influence and also the recognition. You have to put yourself out there. You have to demonstrate leadership. And our diplomatic missions are failing in that context. One thing we always, and this is something which I felt always a bit uncomfortable with, we always are respectful and truthful to our principles and values, and we at times really expose that. But I think when we engage in the new style, we need to trigger, for the same reason, respect to us. And that's a tactical move. You need to create a circumstance whereby the international community is not taking you for granted, but is respecting you. And that will require a lot of diplomatic skills, but it is possible. But if we don't create this mutual beneficial relationship in terms of diplomacy, we will not be taken serious, and people will not see us as mature enough to participate in it. I'm skipping some of the things, but because I want to go to what do we need to do in terms of concrete activities. The rest you will be able to read in the document. Quickly, specifically, new areas for CARICOM diplomacy to engage in: more and strengthened business diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, and in the paper you'll read much more about it. We need to make sure that we do not confuse member states, and I can give you lots of examples where in our own performance we have confused important partners on many issues. The Malvinas is one issue where we confused the Argentinians and the UK government at the same time, up to the point in a span of a week or two. Both ambassadors came to me to the OAS and sat down in my office, not together, separately, and they said, we don't understand what your real position is. And I wasn't even representing CARICOM. But they could not understand that at a meeting there, they supported the Malvinas, and at another meeting, they supported the UK on the Falkland Islands, and totally confused. Now, that in itself is a dangerous thing, because you lose two partners instead of one. It's better to take a position, be firm on it, explain it, argue it, and done with it. But trying to go both ways is a dangerous thing, because it creates mistrust. And this has happened not only on, this is a very nice example, but on many occasions, on many, many occasions. We need to have consistent messaging as part of the diplomatic framework. We need to do also something which is regretfully happening with the increased levels of diplomacy and the different types of diplomacy: avoid disconnected positioning. And what I mean by that is, today, presidential prime ministerial summitry is a form of diplomacy. We have ministerial engagements. We have ambassadorial engagements. Sometimes on the same topic you get different messages. And that's so inconsistent, but it confuses the audience as well, the audience being your counterparts. That is something. So prime ministers should not take a position if it is not properly gone through the process of vetting. And that goes for any other level. It has created embarrassing situations, and it doesn't cater well for the respect we should have. And again, I'm coming back to the point of unity and respect, because those are the strengths which we need to be able to perform, because we don't have the power. We can't force them. And one important point, which is a new element in diplomacy, which we need to engage on, is our engagement at the moment is based on dependency relationships. Where we need to go to is base our engagement on interdependency relationship. They need to be dependent on us as well. They need something, and then we can negotiate. But if you're only depending on them, it is either take it or leave it. But we're not engaging in that way currently. So we need to change that concept from dependency diplomacy to interdependency, create a negotiating space. Now, the interesting part is, what do I suggest in terms of making this happen? By the way, another element of diplomacy beyond diaspora diplomacy and and business diplomacy, cyber diplomacy, which we need to focus on. We have spoken a lot about ICTs and how we can use that, but it is a topic in its own. Again, the skill set is different from what current diplomats have in terms of usage. But in terms of institutional arrangements or rearrangements and capacity, I do believe that we have Caribbean diplomacy, but it is Caribbean diplomacy carried out by nationals. What we need is Caribbean diplomats. And that there is a difference. When the European integration process started, one of the first things they did is the European School of Law, because that's where they taught you European law, and you could speak from a regional brief. So what I'm saying is we need to have a diplomatic course in Caribbean diplomacy so that we have Caribbean diplomats. And these Caribbean diplomats should be able and allowed to work at any foreign ministry in the region so that you get cross-fertilization. I know this is bold, but it must happen. It falls on the free movement of skills, but it will induce a Caribbean thinking at ministerial level in different countries. So Jamaica should be able to work in Guyana as a diplomat in the foreign ministry on the regional briefs, not on the national policies, but on the regional briefs. We need to restructure CARICOM Secretariat, especially the Council on Foreign and Community Relations, to become a much more operative approach. Professor Dukaran spoke already about the whole integration architecture. I do believe that we need a think tank to discuss foreign policy issues on a more regular basis. It's different from a course, it's different from an academic institution, but we need a foreign policy think tank. Like the Council of the Americas, for instance, in the United States, is pretty powerful in terms of influencing policy. People listen to that. People look at their writings. I mean, we need something like that. We need to, we need foreign ministers, and I hope that through this conference we can start that process. We need foreign ministers to really come together to discuss a strategic regional framework for foreign policy and diplomacy with common areas for policy frameworks. And those policy frameworks can be in natural disasters, climate change, it can be on financing for development, migration issues. You need a common position from the region on those issues instead of every country going their own way. By the way, if you have a regional foreign policy framework, when somebody comes to you, somebody being a country, comes to you and says, I'm picking you out to take a different position than the region, you can easily say, this is not on my table anymore. This is regional. So there is a defense mechanism there which you can bring to the table. And that doesn't exist right now. So maybe too much wishful thinking, very ambitious. We need maybe a Caribbean Minister of Foreign Affairs who will lead those political briefs in the world. In the same context, maybe roving ambassadors, which is cost efficient. We need, and I think maybe this is something which the Institute can do together with CARICOM Secretariat, you can have diplomats out there in the field. I'm not sure how many we have, but 15 countries, approximately 4 each, something like 60, 70 heads of missions. They're not meeting together. I've never heard that heads of mission of CARICOM have met ever to discuss CARICOM policy briefs on any issue. So maybe it's a good idea to convene every 2 years a CARICOM, again not a national, but a CARICOM heads of mission conference so that they are informed about the policies which the region wants to espouse and to promote and to direct. In the content of the diplomatic work, they will be able to do better for the region. Keep in mind, they will remain national representatives and do their bilateral work. I see merit in the idea of David Jessup to appoint roving ambassador for specific issues like climate change and so on. We are losing track there. One tricky issue remains, joint representation. I think it should be looked at again. In terms of the in terms of the CARICOM briefs, you need joint representation so that you are optimally, your footprint all over the world is there. And we don't have that as yet because of cost and labor constraints. My last proposal in concrete terms is we need competent diplomats. And again, I'm not saying bad about anybody, but I'm very open about it. I have seen the failures. We need competent diplomats who can carry a brief and not only go to receptions and so on, although they could be even very useful. I think there is even space when it comes to our diplomatic machinery to go into a PPP. And this is, again, bold thinking, outside the box thinking. Why not ask the private sector of the region to appoint business attachés at their cost, but accredited under a diplomatic mission? That's a joint venture with the private sector to carry out what is of interest to them. They will benefit from it. They will get money out of it, investments or whatever, but at least you have a professional who understands the business environment and can speak to it. Let me go to the conclusion, and those are two small points. I don't know if it has something to do with the late hour, but yesterday, Compton Bourne, Professor Bourne, raised a couple of issues, and I told him afterwards, those are exactly the same points I wanted to raise at closing. Maybe it has to do with the hour of the day, that when around 4 o'clock you start thinking in that sense. No, it's not going to be long, very quickly. I think all of what I've said is technically doable. It is, from a policy perspective, is doable. It's going to be a challenge because getting 40 member states on the same page is not going to be easy. But if you can select 2 or 3 of the issues and come to common policy briefs, I think it's doable, it's possible. The problem is that it requires the heads of state, the leaders, to make that decision, to make the call. And you need sustained political commitment. We need clear commitment to implementation and enforcement of recommendations. We need to see that the diplomatic machinery is well coordinated. And that's where my doubt is, that if CARICOM leaders and the ministers of foreign affairs do not go in this direction, we may lose a lot of opportunity in terms of our performance in the international arena, but that's not a goal in itself. The goal is to be able to mobilize resources, to mobilize political influence in a sustained manner. And if we don't get to that point, I'm afraid that apart from being poor in 2050, we will be less and less influential while we have an opportunity. So it doesn't look good if we don't do that. And again, Ambassador Somers made a point earlier yesterday as well, and I haven't gone into that, but creating partnerships and alliances with like-minded regions is critical, like-minded organizations where we are a member of. We're not using those platforms effectively because there is no agenda. There is no strategy, there is no agenda. But setting the agenda is where the leaders come in the picture. And that's where I have my doubt. So I think somehow, with all the intellectual capacity in this room, we have to find a way to get this message across that it is time for action. Or they have to decide otherwise, which is not a good option, and in my view, not an option at all. So I leave it to that, Professor Byron. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, that you let loose a whole panoply of ideas and proposals between yourself and Ambassador Francis and Professor Knight. I just want to say one thing quickly, which is, and here I'm echoing Ambassador Suma. I worked in London at the East Caribbean High Commission. It had already started to go backwards because we represented 3 states then, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Kitts. But we had a staff of 15, and anytime business needed to be done by the OECS, we were called on to do all the work because our 3 other high commissions each had an ambassador and a secretary. We were the only ones with any capacity. I think the OECS has probably the best experience of joint diplomatic missions and what one can do, how one can stretch limited resources with those. And the other small thing is that I don't know how you would consider. Barbados has recently been hosting talks between the Venezuelan government and opposition. And maybe in terms of crisis diplomacy, this is a more recent example of CARICOM countries getting engaged. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had some fascinating ideas, and it's now question time. I think what we should do is take a round of questions to our panel. We should have time for about 2 rounds, at least one, maybe one, because we are getting close to closing. So the floor is open. There's one right, yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Good day to all. The symposium was excellent, excellent, excellent. The ideas are flowing. I think we reached the cream of the information here, but the thing is, I mentioned to Professor earlier, most times we get ideas, but the dormancy and the waiting time of this period of good ideas, I wonder always, why don't we put it into action, and who is responsible? Thank you.
Okay, that's your question. Other questions, comments? Or are we getting tired at this point? Yes.
I think, okay, good afternoon. My name is Sobiana Stewart, and the last presenter spoke a little bit about a topic that really interests me particularly, and he would have spoken of a Caribbean diplomatic, well, he didn't say it in those words, but I'm thinking that what you're suggesting is a Caribbean diplomatic corps, where you have a group of diplomats that are specific to the region and not to the states, similar to what obtains in the EU, I guess. But since we always have a problem when we talk about resources and funding, where do you propose that the funding for this kind of diplomatic corps of, or cadre of trained diplomats will come from?
Thank you. Other comments? Yes.
Really, a comment and a question to Ambassador Ramlin. I was very struck by his suggestion of geopolitical strategic plan, which will be the basis, will have to define the basis of the foreign policy. I see a lot of value in that. My question is, and let me also say that I don't think it was, in former days, the governments, at least in some of their international engagements, would meet and have a plan. They will have some concept of what they're going to try to achieve on a particular occasion as a group. I think in particular the encounters with Canada or with different heads of other different countries. It doesn't quite approximate what you're talking about. Yours is more broader and more ambitious, and I think more meaningful. So my question is, how do you see this being put into operation?
Thank you. Are there any more questions or comments? Well, I'd like to add one question before we turn it over to the panel. And John, I hope that Professor Knight is around if he wants to weigh in. Ambassador Francis spoke about reorganizing diplomacy around climate change. And I wanted him to elaborate a little bit more on what that would entail. For example, greater contributions to SIDEMA, for example. SIDEMA is mostly maintained by international development cooperation contributions, as well as what the countries put in. Would it entail additional training in climate financing for our diplomats and other officials, things like that? I'd like you to elaborate on that. So I'll turn it, Dave?
It just occurred to me that Similar to Compton's question on the geopolitical strategic plan, the whole concept of a common Caribbean diplomatic position kind of glosses over the inherent conflicts that may happen between countries. You know, our recent example could probably be the whole Petro-Caribe issue where some of our Caribbean neighbors obviously had an interest in that, and Trinidad and Tobago had an opposite position. And sometimes when we talk about these regional issues, we never talk about the mechanics, about how you're going to come to a common position when your interests are so diametrically opposed. So I don't know if you could comment on that.
So at this point, I'll hand it back to the panel. Who would like to start?
Okay, can you hear me? Good. Let me start with the easier one from your. Yes, I exactly mean a Caribbean diplomatic corps, which is Caribbean in nature, which is in service of the region. Whether they will be employed by the CARICOM Secretariat or a different body, still to be seen. But it is a bit similar to what the Europeans are doing. And I see enormous value of cross-fertilization, of knowledge sharing, but also of carrying out that brief, those briefs which there is common consensus on. How do we finance that? Partly, I don't want to say it will be budget neutral, but partly those activities that missions would undertake normally in the context at the national level with regard to those common briefs do not need to be done anymore at the national level. That means that you don't need to put specialists in climate change or in financing for development or whatever at the missions. Either you give those people an opportunity to become regional diplomats, or you take them out, and that will be cost saving, but at the same time, the cost will come to the region. We need to look in this whole context, and when we speak about the integration architecture, we spoke much more about the policy issues. I think we should look also at the financing of the integration architecture and revisit that in terms of allocations and priorities. I see this as a priority when it comes to exposing the region to the external audience. This geopolitical plan, I couldn't expand too much on it, Professor Compton and Dr. Shiratan. There are two things which I want to say. Is, yes, we need to discuss much more in detail, how do you come, what kind of mechanism are you going to use to come to the elements for a geopolitical plan. One of the elements is, and this is one of the proposals as well, is we need to have an engagement strategy with the 5 large political players in the world. And I speak about a common position for the region on that. I speak about the United States, Russia, European Union, India, and China. And I can explain a little bit why the choice is for these 5. Okay? But we need a common regional policy on that. The reason I'm saying that is you don't want to be caught as small states operating as a region and become collateral damage in the political play between the two, between powers in that sense. We have to know our place, but our strength as well. So if you leave it at the national level, that freedom, then you get those things to be picked out and to be granted something, and then you can change your view. When it's a regional position, it's much more difficult, and you can negotiate on behalf of the region. Now, mechanisms to do that, the easiest one would be if leaders would understand the risks the region is running if there is no action taken. That we have a heritage, a legacy to take care of in terms of existing commitments and loyalties, understand that. That's transition. It's going to be a process, not going to happen immediately. But at least we have to make a start with crafting a geopolitical strategy which incorporates the 5 countries, the 5 big players, the key issues which are central to our strategic position, but also the existing relationships which we have. That means in the neighborhood, that's Latin America and Central America, we have the existing relationship which are there with Canada, United Kingdom, in the case of Suriname with the Netherlands. Those are still valuable diplomatic alliances. But the question is, it should not be the one-way relationship anymore. It should be an interdependent relationship. And crafting that is a little bit of a different work. But it's doable, it's possible. The thing is getting the consensus on it and the implementation and the enforcement. I want to even go to the point of different types of penalties if countries don't comply with the regional policy. But that's maybe too far-fetched at this point. I know, I'm too ambitious, Ms. Neely.
Okay, Ambassador Francis, you have questions, and I'm sure you also have opinions. You also have views on all these ideas.
Thank you, Professor. Let us not forget that in the past, on really important issues, critical to the welfare and development of the Caribbean, we have been successful in acting in unison. We did this with considerable effort, much poise, and much success, for example, when Britain decided it was going to enter the European community. And when the preferences that we were enjoying in the British market for our exports came under threat. That then morphed into what became the Lomé Convention. The Caribbean members almost assumed leadership of the ACP to negotiate Lomé's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then subsequently Cotonou. So we do have a history and a capacity, I suppose, when confronted with issues of survival, to act with unison and influence in order to serve our interests. Now, when I sat in Geneva, I can tell you that Caribbean heads of mission caucused regularly, particularly on issues related to the World Trade Organization, where we were negotiating as a group in the Doha Development Round. It was our mission to get the WTO to accept that small and vulnerable economies needed special derogation under the rules of the WTO. And we were able to do that. It's not easy. There was hostility from places that would amaze you. But through persistence, research, the organization of the region in the capitals to provide the sort of framework and guidance that Ambassador Ramden is speaking about in terms of a negotiating strategy and a negotiating brief, that work was done. Now you do have, for example, the situation where in 2012, for example, there was a resolution in the United Nations in New York that the intent of which was to get Palestine to be recognized in the UN General Assembly as a non-state observer member of the Assembly. Now, the significance of this is that until that time, Palestine was not recognized as a state because there is no territory. There is no clearly demarked territory that is clearly under negotiation and discussion with Israel and with key players in the international community. The resolution succeeded. CARICOM was split. Some voted for, some voted against, quite a number abstained. So let us not get confused, because the notion exists sometimes, you read things in the newspaper, that the European Union has a common, unified, strong position and presents always a common front in its negotiations. Nothing could be further from the truth. They fight no differently from we do. I've seen it in play. I've seen it in play in the WTO, and I've seen it in play in UNESCO. So the fact that we are from the same region and we may have different interests does not mean that it is not possible sometimes to find a working or workable consensus that will bring as many players as possible under the umbrella. For instance, one of the things that we did in negotiations in the WTO is that if we are framing a Caribbean position and there were sensitivities on the part of some states, okay, you'd work as hard as you can to get them on board and to cover those concerns. It's not always possible. But you would never openly and publicly in the negotiating session either speak against or give the impression that that fracture exists. We did it in climate change as well. Don't for 1 minute think that all SIDS had the same interests in the climate agreement. They did not. Caribbean SIDS had a different sort of emphasis in certain areas than, for instance, the Pacific. So we had to work hard in the group to maintain that unity of focus in order to ensure, because you are better off under the umbrella than you would be individually. Your traction is really determined and influenced by your ability to keep that consensus and to use it strategically and skillfully. Now, to answer the question about the climate, using climate change as the bulwark to take us where we need to go. What I'm talking about, what I'm proposing, is not something academic. It's not something that comes after you've discussed the imperatives of, capital formation in the country, in the Caribbean, and heightened emphasis on the part of governments on providing incentives for better innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm talking about anchoring all of that on a climate change platform. That has to be, in my view, our approach. That is what has captured the imagination of the international community. And that is what confronts us as a region as an existential problem. We have moral authority and credibility in climate change. We were leaders in the negotiations. They came to us all of the time to get an idea of what we were thinking. Because politically, it would be inconceivable for the big interests, who are really the ones responsible for polluting the atmosphere, to go somewhere in a room, come to an agreement, and the people who are most disproportionately affected, the poor countries, are somewhere locked out and simply handed a fait accompli. So engagement at all levels becomes important. I am talking about, I did not conceive myself of the geostrategic plan that Ambassador Ramdin referred to. But perhaps something, some document, some framework that lays out in clear terms how the Caribbean can leverage its development based on the reality that it confronts this existential problem. It is not going away. 50 years from now, there is a recent statistic, for instance, that indicates that the Arctic ice shields and glaciers are melting 50% faster than was thought. And that temperatures being taken now in the Arctic regions are what they were projected to be 60 years from now. In other words, we are reaching a level of global warming now that scientists anticipated would occur 60 years hence. So these are real issues, and the international community is seized of it. I'm talking about an all-encompassing approach. I'm talking about the University of the West Indies, for instance, in the economics department, launching courses in climate economics. You know, I'm talking about all planning that takes place sectorally in the region being hinged upon the need to achieve sustainability. An economy that is green and growing, that creates new opportunities in entrepreneurship, new opportunities for investment, both domestic and foreign, strategically aligned to objectives that serve the purpose of stabilizing the global climate and minimizing the risk that we face. So I'm talking about something that is permanent, long-term, strategic, and that lends itself to proper monitoring so that we are in a position to determine if and where we need to make adjustments. So that I see all of the other things, all of the other issues, the investment and the trade and all of that, being subsumed under a climate-driven economic strategy for the Caribbean. That, for me, is what is going to create the sustainability and the resilience. Because what was said yesterday indicates to me clearly that we can talk until the cows come home about the innovation, the digital economy, the new economy, the knowledge economy. But if this place does not exist in 50 years, to what end? What's the point? Are we planning for our demise? Or are we planning for the welfare and for the success of generations hence, so that this region can exercise its rights to make a contribution to the global system and to global civilization, as we have done in the past? No one else can do it for us. No one else has the experience, has the history, has the understanding that the Caribbean has in terms of how its society and economy has evolved. And when we've done it in unison, and when we have done it is not easy work, it is difficult work. It's dirty work. We have to be frank. It is dirty work. It requires a lot of heavy lifting. But we can't rely on others to do that dirty work for us. Our vital interests, I end by saying, our vital interests dictate that we take that approach. Because if we don't, ...
Thank you, Ambassador Francis. I need to know if Professor Knight wishes to intervene at this point. Andy, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Just a few minor points, and I'll be very, very brief. Um, there are a couple concepts I think we can utilize that would help us in understanding some of the things that are being said here today. Um, one is we need to change our view of foreign policy from the sort of nationalistic approach that we've taken in the past to a much more pluralistic approach, or the plurilateral approach, I should say, to foreign policy. And that is, and I think it sort of coincides with what Ambassador Francis has said and Ambassador Ramdin has said as well. This means that you can also utilize subsidiarity as a principle around which you make those kinds of decisions. So, for example, when you have a problem within the region, where the region is most affected by a particular circumstance, obviously we should be responsible for being part of the policy making around that particular issue. And that's where subsidiarity comes into play. It requires a different kind of thinking about how foreign policy is being made as well. So when it comes to that question about, who's going to pay for this, we're normally thinking the way we normally think about foreign policy, that there's an envelope within a national government to pay for particular positions within the national government. We have to think completely differently about how that money is going to be obtained, and it may be partly part of PPPs, private partnerships with public positions as well, or it could be something like what happened within the United Nations when Kofi Annan introduced the thing called the Global Compact, where you have the private sector actually contributing to foreign policy matters and human rights matters in that case. The final thing I want to say has to do with a question that was asked at the very beginning, and it relates to the issue of implementation deficit in the region. We come up with a lot of great ideas. I'm sure this symposium is going to have marvelous ideas about what should be done. And Ambassador Ramdin, and both Ambassador Ramdin and Ambassador Dennis Francis, you both came up with some excellent suggestions about what needs to be done. The question is, how are we going to implement it? Who's going to be responsible for the implementation? And we always seem to fall down on that particular point. And that's where the implementation deficit comes in. We always seem to fall down on taking these great concepts and turn them into actual policies on the ground. So I think that's something that we need to think about, a strategy of implementation for all these great ideas that are coming out from the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Knight. I think I'm going to bring this panel to a close at this time. I'd like to thank all the panelists for some fascinating ideas, very spirited and passionate presentations that we have all enjoyed. And I'd like also to thank the audience for your very pointed and very useful questions and the discussion that has ensued. Thanks to you. An excellent panel. Thank you very much. And we are now nearing the end. And all that I have to do at this point is to invite Dr. Dave Siratan, who has been the chair of the organizing committee of this symposium and who has worked very, very hard for its success. He has raised a lot of money for this symposium, and I now invite him to bring matters to a close. All the best.
Thank you, Jessica. Well, I am supposed to be delivering the closing comments, which is a pretty broad title. But there are a couple of things I want to mention in closing. The first, of course, is just to talk a little bit about the objective of the symposium. When myself and Mr. Dukuran first began this discussion, it centered around the whole issue of the development challenges that the Caribbean face and the fact that the orthodox policy solutions and so on had not really delivered on the type of results that we had expected. So it is in that context that we wanted to have a discussion that kind of moved us out of our comfort zone in terms of the status quo, in terms of how we normally would have governed ourselves and implemented policies and so on. So that is the reason for the title of the symposium, which is The Caribbean on the Edge, rising above the orthodoxy of development thinking. And I have to credit Winston with much of the language for that, because it captured the essence of what we wanted to achieve in the symposium. Allied to that, of course, was the areas that we wanted to cover. And given the primary economic nature of the existential threats that the region faced, we had a series of sub-themes. One, of course, was the economic thought and development thinking in the Caribbean, which was the first session, basically. Capital flows and financing in the region, integration and convergence in the Caribbean political economy, and last, but by no means least, the change in global space for the practice of Caribbean diplomacy. The other main objective of the symposium, of course, was to honor Sir Alister McIntyre, who had a very significant impact on virtually all 4 areas that we plan to focus in on the symposium. Professor Bourne, at the very beginning of the symposium, actually did a reviewed and went over the contribution, the developmental contribution of Sir Alister. And as we found out, although he was an economist by training, he practiced, led the region in the areas of integration, of diplomacy, economic policy, and of course, he was the first, one of the first leader of the Caribbean integration movement, so he has served in many capacities. And it was strange how his life's work kind of dovetailed with the challenges that we now face in these serious areas. During the course of the conference, we would have heard many interesting papers on many different issues along these sub-themes, the lines of these sub-themes. And what struck me most was I have been going to these conferences on Caribbean development for many, many years, and this is one of the first conferences where so many of the presentations actually generated some new ideas and challenged our traditional beliefs in some of the previous policies that we had adopted over the years and so on. So I think in that respect, in terms of us wanting to get some more unorthodox, out-of-the-box thinking, we would have definitely achieved that in terms of the content and the presentations of all the presenters over the 2 days on the symposium. So I want to thank all the presenters for their hard work. Many of them came from afar, broke their various schedules and so on to be with us today, so I want to extend a special thanks to them. I also want to make the point that the whole idea behind the symposium was also that we want to put down for posterity our ideas and the kinds of solutions we are proposing. So the idea is that we will be publishing a monograph based on the proceedings of this symposium, and I want to encourage all the people who would have presented here. I know some of them will have, these thoughts will have been initial musings about these areas and so on, but I want to encourage them to put it down on paper in a formal way so that we can begin the whole process of publication. Because I think, you know, where academics fall down in many cases is where we come to these events, we have all these great ideas, all these proposals, and we never either document what we have done and what we are proposing, and also we have not done a very good job of pushing our ideas. And that is something that's a strength of Sir Alister, because one of his great strengths was to get other people, in particular politicians who make decisions, to actually cotton in to some of his ideas and for the region and so on, right? So it's not only good to come up with these ideas, we have to have the nous to be able to push these ideas with the people who matter, that is the decision makers and the political leaders. Okay, so part of the objective of the symposium will be to ensure that we document this thing in a publication and use it as a tool to push some of the agendas that we have outlined over these last 2 days. Right, and last but by no means least, I of course have to thank a number of people. Jessica mentioned that I raised a lot of money, quote unquote, but I did not, it's not the beneficial, I should not get the accolades, it's really to the people who were generous enough to contribute to the symposium. And as most of you who have organized these events know, it is not only the intellectual capital that's important for the success of the event, but the financial capital as well. And we would have been very lucky to get sponsorship from, first of all, the Central Bank of the Bahamas. And if you know Bahamians well, you know they are very, very generous people. And I want to take this opportunity to ask all of us here in this room to spare a thought for Bahamian brothers and sisters and do whatever you can to help them in the current prediction. We also got support from the Central Bank of Bahamas, the Office of Graduate Studies here at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, and the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. We also have people to thank. I want, of course, to thank the Symposium Organizing Committee, which included Professor Byron, Professor Dukeran, Dr. Georgina Shami, Ms. Ikana McAllister, Mr. John Maloney, who is there at the back of the room organizing the IT resources, Ms. Michelle Siraj, Ms. Zara Weeks-Reiser, and Ms. Chanel Glasgow from the Office of Marketing and Communications here at the university. We also want to thank the McIntyre family, Lady McIntyre, as well as both Nicholas and Arnold, who attended on the first day to be with us in honoring their father. And in closing, I also want to thank the intellectual capital here in the room, people who came from far and wide to present their views and share their ideas on these development challenges that we face. And all the participants who came to listen, I want to thank you for your patience and your contribution to the success of this symposium. And I want to wish all of you a successful week ahead, and particularly our foreign participants safe travels to their home destination. Thank you.